Hi, everyone. My name is Abby E. Murray, and I am the Poet Laureate for the city of Tacoma, Washington. I'm the editor in chief of the literary journal Collateral, and I'm the author of Hail and Farewell, a collection of poems that won the Perugia Press Poetry Prize in 2019. I'm a poet and a poetry instructor, and I'm here to teach a series of 3 workshops focused on the healing possibilities found in poetry. Here's a little bit about how these workshops usually go. These are meant to be generative, which means the objective is to generate new work that contributes to your own healing and recovery process. At the beginning of each workshop, I'll share the text that I'm using in case you would like to look up a poet or a specific piece and learn more. And each session begins with an intention and moves into a discussion of some poetic craft, element, or a technique. This includes my own thoughts as well as excerpts from poetry texts, and I'll always be sharing some poems. At the end of workshops, we'll always conclude with some prompts for you to take away. I'm happy to give you a bit of brief feedback if you send those drafts to me at gritcitypoetlaureate@gmail.com. And just as a reminder, my background is wholly literary. It's in poetry and teaching. I have no therapy background. All of my feedback will come from a place of teaching and a background of poetry. Normally, also, just a precursor, I teach face-to-face. As Poet Laureate, I get to teach poetry workshops throughout the community at veteran centers, community centers, libraries, schools. And due to the global pandemic, we've all had to make rearrangements. That said, I am used to dialogue and a chance for writers to ask questions and offer insights. So if you have either of those to share, you're welcome to send those to me as well at Grit City Poet Laureate. In the meantime, just know that I'm recording this from my home library. And if the doorbell rings, my dog is going to go insane. She is hiding out here in the corner. Say hi, Dorie. Oh, she just flipped her tail really quickly. All right. That's a little bit about how these workshops are going to go. So this is the first of 3 workshops. And the intention for the first workshop is we're going to consider the healing possibilities that are found in poetry, and we'll listen to poems that draw on healing experiences. We're going to think about specifically the right to write. Who can and should be writing? Here's what I'm going to be using today. I have my notes. I have the bilingual edition of Jimmy Santiago Baca's selected poems. I have a copy of my well-worn Writing Poetry to Save Your Life by Maria Mazziati Gillen. And I'm going to be referencing Writing as a Way of Healing by Louise DeSalvo. And at the end of workshops, when I give you prompts, you're likely going to need a pen and paper or word processor so that you can be writing poems of your own. In Writing as a Way of Healing, Louise DeSalvo, she opens up about her personal desire to write, and she summarizes research findings that conclude not just writing, but writing and thinking and feeling about difficult experiences and emotions can lead to improved emotional and physical health. And then she goes on in the beginning of this book to discuss the importance of honoring the desire to write, which is to say we have to allow ourselves the chance to heal by writing. And this can be a lot harder than it sounds. Writing a poem when you are uncertain or uncomfortable or unfamiliar with poetry or even your own emotions, it can take a long while, sometimes years, to realize that you can act on wanting to write, that you can write. And you might need to break down some barriers first. As a poetry instructor, I've lost count of how many people I have worked with who have complex, vivid stories to tell, and yet they begin with, I'm not a poet, but, or I'm not a writer, but, and then they go on to share these deeply compelling stories. So we're going to work on kind of moving through that feeling, that experience. But I want to back up for just one second. Why do I keep saying chance and possibility when I talk about healing in poetry? Well, poetry is not in itself a cure to trauma or addiction of any kind. It's not a miracle practice that can be used, just simply by going through the motions. I remember listening to Kay Ryan speak in Washington, D.C. years ago, and she described poetry not as one of the healing arts, but as savage. And she was right. Poetry is truth-telling, and it can absolutely tear us apart. But she was also describing poetry as it is for her, and she knew this. Writing has absolutely been written by those seeking recovery. It's been instrumental in many people's healing processes. Writing, whether you're doing it in the pursuit of healing or human connection, it should not be done solely for the purpose of publication or, worse, perfection. Poetry is a process. It is not a product. And therefore, poetry is always available to you. It does not require perfection. Speaking of perfection, let's bring in Writing Poetry to Save Your Life by Maria Mazziati-Gillen. Maria was a mentor of mine when I was a PhD student out in upstate New York. And so I'm very familiar with her teaching style and with her poetry. She often refers to the inner editor's voice as the crow. It sits on our shoulder and it squawks and it bites and it tells us, it reminds us constantly that we are not good enough, we are not smart enough, we are not interesting enough to be writing poems. The crow is an amalgamation of every authority figure you have ever come in contact with in your life. So imagine all of those abusive friends or relatives, the teacher who thought you'd amount to nothing. These are the voices that are inside of the crow or your inner editor. Maria is a powerhouse poet with a long, long history of great accomplishments. And I'm going to share some of her poetry in just a minute. But her incredible life in publishing and speaking and reading and serving doesn't mean she's always confident and comfortable. And so I want to share a little excerpt from the chapter in this book called Learning to Let Go. And it shares one of those experiences. First, it starts with some insight to who poets are, and then it goes into one of these experiences where she had to learn to let go. So this is from the chapter Learning to Let Go on page 16. The Greeks believed that poets could hear the voices of the gods and had the ability to interpret their wishes. The Greeks understood that poets are born with one less layer of skin and are open to what is true about being human, as well as courageous about stating those truths. Modern life is full of noise and busyness, which can distract you from discerning these truths. That's why it's an important part of the process to find stillness and quiet each day so you can tap into that part of yourself where truth abides. When confronting that blank page, you must allow yourself the freedom to loosen up. If you catch yourself changing lines, crossing out, going back to revise, you are not letting go. You cannot get to a deeper place inside yourself or in your writing unless you're willing to trust your instincts. You cannot control this process with your mind. I realized the importance of this when Diane DePrima and I were on a reading tour, and she suggested that I bring painting supplies. After we arrived at the hotel, she left me alone in my room to paint. I started to get very nervous when confronted by the blank drawing pad. My hands felt stiff and unnatural. I became increasingly upset that I couldn't draw a perfect rose, even though I was staring at one in front of the window. I kept tearing off sheets and trying again, and finally I had a pile of muddied, blurred paintings. Suddenly I realized this is the very thing I warned my students, my writing students, against. I took a deep breath and tried to let go the way I had learned years ago with my writing. The painting did not have to be perfect. It did not have to be anyone else's idea of the perfect rose. I had to look at the world through my own eyes and paint it, the same way I did when writing a poem. Once I realized that, I was able to paint, and my hand and wrist loosened. I was happy with my creation. I stopped worrying about whether it was good or bad. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I was painting, and I was pleased because the colors and shapes were translations of what I saw in my mind. The time alone in that room I see now was a gift. In writing, you must give yourself the same gift. 20 minutes are enough to write a draft of a poem. Believe that, and your hand too will loosen up, and you will be surprised and delighted by your own creation. Wholly believe in that. Whether you already are aware of it or not, you carry the authority to write your story. The true difficult challenge is the pursuit of telling that story, the permission you need to give yourself to speak or write the truth. The authority you already have. It is your story. It is your truth. You may speak it. There's an excerpt from Louise DeSalvo's book that I want to share with you really quickly. And she's writing about discovering her own authority to write, her own authority over her creative self, her creative ambitions. Let's see. If we commit ourselves to engaging in the process of writing, our work will evolve and mature. Becoming competent takes time, and we all have within ourselves the capacity to do it. Yet instead of being helped to achieve this healing insight, I was taught that, in the words of one of my English teachers, when it comes to being a writer, you either have it or you don't. This simply isn't so. Works of literature were created, I was told, because the writers wanted to make objects of beauty, not because they needed to understand life's difficult, perplexing, or traumatic moments. Art for art's sake, I thought, not art for the sake of life. As a young woman, I didn't have the opportunity to learn what I needed to know, that famous writers had written the stories they needed to tell in order to help themselves heal from the traumatic events in their lives, and that I too could help myself immeasurably by writing about my pain. Now I'm going to share a poem of Maria's where she looks head on at shame, which is the title of the poem as well. Maria's husband Dennis passed away, and she wrote many poems confronting this grief. That's something that could be helpful to know before hearing some of her poems. This is called Shame. Today I was thinking about shame and how much it is part of everything we do. The way I was ashamed at 10 to say to my cousin that my mother asked me to buy toilet paper, as though my grown-up male cousin didn't use toilet paper, and wasn't stuck with all those messy bodily functions we have to plan our lives around. The way public bathrooms and our need for them remind us of our humanity, a cosmic joke on us, so we won't forget how rooted we are to the earth and not the ethereal beings the nuns wanted us to be. Today I was thinking about shame, and I see Dennis, thin and frail and naked. The skin stretched tight over his big bones, not an ounce of fat to cover him. The skin blue and translucent as he crawls from the bedroom on his helpless legs to the bathroom. How ashamed he is, as though his illness were a failure of his own manhood, and he to blame. How he pounds his fists on the floor in frustration. How he scuttles into the bathroom and closes the door, but not before I see the dark well of sorrow in his eyes. Today, when I am thinking about shame and wish it were only toilet paper or a red splotch on my dress or my inability to learn the periodic table in chemistry that made me feel it, instead of my convoluted feelings about my husband's illness, how nothing in our lives is all one thing or another. Not love, not grief, not anger, but always mixed with its opposite emotion. I see Dennis crawling along the floor, and I am struck with the axe of grief, a terrible pity that can do no good, but mixed in with it the shame of my own impatience, when he can't remember something I told him 2 minutes ago, or when he struggles for 20 minutes to open a package and won't accept help, or when he insists he can walk down the stairs and falls, the corrosive shame of my quick annoyance, the shame of my lack of patience, the shame of feeling that his illness is a deep and muddy river in which we both will drown. Whew. Need some time to absorb that. This is a good time, actually, to bring in the poems of Kimi, Santiago, Baca. Just a little bit of background about this poet. He was born in 1952. From a very young age, experienced multiple forms of abandonment. At 13, ran away from the orphanage where he was left. And a few years after that, he was imprisoned on drug charges. While he was in prison, he taught himself to read and to write and began writing poetry. His work often centers on recovery, addiction, and also marginalized groups of people and social justice. And I want to share with you two of his poems. The first one is called A Poet's Love. And I forgot to say this earlier, but in all my workshops, I say the first time that you hear a poem, try as hard as you can to go back to that smallest, youngest version of yourself where it's just story time. You're overhearing someone or you're sitting down to listen to someone tell you a story. We're hardwired as humans to really be drawn to that narrative. It helps us make sense of things. When you hear a poem for the first time, approach it as if it was story time. You're not required to write a thesis on this poem. It doesn't owe you anything, and you don't owe the poem anything either. Try to come to every poem with no expectations, if possible. I say that knowing that I also need to follow my own advice. So this is A Poet's Love by Kimi, Santiago, Baca, and I want you to listen to it as if it is story time and let whatever resonates with you and your own experiences, just let that happen. A Poet's Love. Two men in me. In the smoke prowls a fearful man who goes by another name, has another soul with another mind. What I feel, he denies. What I dream, he undreams. What I hope, he despairs. And what I love, he despises. Every healing I experience, he infects with an addiction, torments me with fears, intimately loves, then rejects me, certain of my love, then disorientated. I want it, he resists it, suspended between commitment and promiscuity. I need the river. I need to run by the water. It bends and blends me into the darkness of black crow feathers, where I listen to stones speak of our inseparable spirits. I need to be by the river, where I can dream of being hundreds of miles away, toting my rucksack, hiking sage trails, across rocky slopes in boots, green cap, beige pants, blue sports tee-top, and red pullover. My love for the river is rooted in what's fallen and what's transformed. Seasons survive beneath leaf skin where I cocoon my memories, and am released a moth in the afternoon to float by a honeysuckle vine strung along the river trees. The river and I see through each other's skin, behind the eyes into the tunnels of water bone and rushing marrow, into an even wider sky than ours, a larger earth than where I run, a broader river than where I pray. I love this poem, and we also get a different perspective of the crow as an image, a place to dissolve and become part of nature, return to being part of nature. I want to read one more poem by Baca, and then we're going to get to some prompts to send you on your way. This poem is called Who Understands Me But Me? And I want you to pay attention to the repetition that's used in this poem, and pay attention specifically to the images. I think it's possible to do that and also just let the poem sort of wash over you as you listen to it. Who Understands Me But Me by Santiago, Baca. They turn the water off, so I live without water. They build walls higher, so I live without treetops. They paint the windows black, so I live without sunshine. They lock my cage, so I live without going anywhere. They take each last tear I have. I live without tears. They take my heart and rip it open. I live without heart. They take my life and crush it, so I live without a future. They say I am beastly and fiendish, so I have no friends. They stop up each hope, so I have no passage out of hell. They give me pain, so I live with pain. They give me hate, so I live with my hate. They have changed me, and I am not the same man. They give me no shower, so I live with my smell. They separate me from my brothers, so I live without brothers. Who understands me when I say, this is beautiful? Who understands me when I say, I have found other freedoms? I cannot fly or make something appear in my hand. I cannot make the heavens open or the earth tremble. I can live with myself, and I am amazed at myself, my love, my beauty. I am taken by my failures, astounded by my fears. I am stubborn and childish in the midst of this wreckage of life they incurred. I practice being myself, and I have found parts of myself never dreamed of by me. They were goaded out from under rocks in my heart when the walls were built higher, when the water was turned off and the windows painted black. I followed these signs like an old tracker and followed the tracks deep into myself, followed the blood-spotted path, deeper into dangerous regions, and found so many parts of myself who taught me water is not everything, and gave me new eyes to see through walls. And when they spoke, sunlight came out of their mouths. and I was laughing at me with them. We laughed like children and made pacts to always be loyal. Who understands me when I say, this is beautiful? I love that poem, and depending on the day that I've had when I read it, I hear that last question as either an earnest asking for an answer, wanting to know who else out there understands me when I say that this is beautiful, that so much was taken away, and yet this is what I found anyway. And some days I hear it as a challenge. Who would dare to speak up against that person's experience? Okay, so I want to move into some prompts for you to take away from these workshops. I have a couple of them for you to choose from. In my community workshops, the prompts are meant to be springboards into creative ideas. Usually I teach in the evenings, and sometimes we're all pretty tired from work, and we need a couple of just something to get us jumping up and down, I guess. So you can choose from these prompts if you would like. However, if you have something else rolling around in your head, especially after our discussions, I encourage you to write that, to pursue that. Let that be your poem. I'm happy to give you a bit of brief feedback if you want to send those over at gritcitypoetlaureate@gmail.com. I want you to kind of go back to how Maria was talking about writing without the crow, or, bypassing that crow as you begin and you continue to write. Just write. Just keep your hand moving. This is the important part. The first prompt is from Maria's book. The whole second half of this book, it's actually more than half, just slightly. The whole second half of this is just writing prompts. And they're all in the form of unfinished phrases or single sentences to get your memories moving around. For example, I come from a long line of... What comes to mind? So the first prompt is to take a couple of these unfinished phrases and see where they lead you. Here are the ones that I think you should choose from this time. If only. The things we tried to say. When I can't sleep, I worry about what you need to do. And all I wanted was... Take one of those lines, fill in the blank, and keep your pen moving. If you hit a wall on any of those sentences, start a new line and keep going. Doesn't even need to be completed. Just keep your thoughts moving. Your thoughts are really already still moving. It's really the important part is keeping your pen moving to really give those thoughts the respect that I think they've been needing. The second prompt is make a list of everything that has been taken from you and everything that you've given away. Make those lists and then stand back and read them like they're poems, because they are. Your third prompt is make a list of everything you need and be specific. Remember, Baca tells us of the honeysuckle vine. He tells us of the red pullover and running by the river water, the crow feathers. Be specific. Instead of saying you need supplies, tell me you need 1 loaf of bread, 1 bottle of soap. And the last poetry prompt is write a poem from the point of view of the crow. If you'd like to share that poem, do so. But then part of this prompt is tactile, and I would like you to rip that poem into shreds. So those are the 4 prompts that I have for you this time. I'll see you again for the second poetry workshop focused on the healing possibilities of poetry right here in my home library. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you soon.